Welcome to another edition of Around with Randall, your weekly podcast on making your nonprofit more effective for your community. And here is your host, the CEO and founder of Hallett Philanthropy, Randall Hallett.
Thank you so much for joining me, Randall, on this edition of Around with Randall. A new subject maybe for many of us in the nonprofit world, and if you're a consultant, maybe it's a little more viable in terms of conversations that you've had or something you have to deal with. But I was fascinated that I ran into this and then made a couple phone calls and found a couple of other examples. And the issue is non-competes. And while I think non-competes have surrounded and certainly are being discussed nationally, which we'll get to in a moment, I never thought about them, particularly when it came to nonprofits, in particular with gift officers. And what I have discovered is there's a couple of examples where this actually popped up. And so I thought I would try to address it. And I find it an interesting nexus for me because of my legal background and having been had to apply it to the work I do, particularly in consulting, and then also a little bit when I was an executive at the medical center. So let's start from the very beginning. Non-competes are used, as probably most of you know, to restrict access post-employment, normally, regarding someone who has a talent set that people are fearful could be used in a negative way against them as an individual, or more importantly, about the organization. So leaving one to go to another. They've been in existence forever. There are some basic reasons why this is occurring. I think that number one, there is a further realization, particularly with gift officers and executives in nonprofits, that they are very valuable and the relationships that they have value. In particular, if they are connected and or associated with larger funders and basically being stolen for access to certain people in the community that can make philanthropic gifts. This is further a challenge, because our turnover rate for gift officers is anywhere between 18 and 19 months. For many of those who are turning over quite a bit, it's because they don't produce. But we know that gift officers will leave, and this comes back to the study that Hallett Philanthropy did, that I did 2 years ago, when we were seeing the first moments of inflation. There, all of a sudden, there was realization, I'm not getting paid what I am worth, and I'm expecting and demanding more resources, salary, because I'm an incredible ROI, return on investment. As a gift officer, I'm being paid X, but I'm delivering 6, 7, 8X times as much. I'd like a little bit more money. The other situation that has occurred that I think plays a part is interest rates. And you might say, wait, what? The mobility of people to change jobs, and also while needing to change cities, has become a little more complicated. We have gotten used to, which is incredibly odd, to 2%, 3% interest rate. So you're locked into a house that you can't move. So, and by the way, juxtapose that. My parents bought their first house at 13.5% interest. So 6 and 7 is not the end of the world. Certainly not as good as 2 or 3, but context is important. But the decision of wanting to move, let's say take a job in another community, and it's a great opportunity, is being hindered or held back, not just in the nonprofit world, but all over the place, by the fact they've got a 2.38% interest rate on a 15-year fixed mortgage. They're like, well, I can't give that up and move to another city where it may or may not be more expensive and take out an interest rate of 6.5%, 7%, 8%, depending on the moment. So all of these things are meaning there's more pressure to find staffing in the same community. And when you put that pressure, nonprofits, I'm beginning to feel, and it's at the higher ends, healthcare, higher ed, probably some conversations around interests in larger nonprofits, United Way, social service, bigger places. They're actually contemplating this. And in a couple of examples, I had gift officers who came to me and said, I need some advice. For the first time, I'm being asked to sign a non-compete in this new job, or I'm being asked to sign a non-compete. I've been here for 5 years. I'm not sure what just happened. And what this has done is caused a real problem for the individual, the gift officer, to say, I'm uncomfortable with this. It's the first time they've dealt with it. It's also important to realize that there's movement on this entire issue. So you may or may not have heard, but the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, issued an opinion in the last month that said, we believe non-competes are illegal. They aren't allowed at all. And they use their bureaucratic power to issue a ruling. Now, those of us who maybe have studied the law are already seeing this going all the way to the Supreme Court, most likely. The question becomes not whether or not non-competes are legal or illegal, but does the Federal Trade Commission have the ability to make that kind of decision that is so widespread, so impactful across the United States? I'm going to guess, don't have that power. At the same time, we're seeing some of the states get involved with this. So there are 4 states, and one's actually not a state, that have said in many cases for years that non-competes are not legal in their state. California, North Dakota, Oklahoma, and Washington, D.C. is the pseudo state, that they're not even allowed. It's illegal. So if you live in these states, it doesn't make any difference what your employer wants to do. It doesn't mean anything. There are also states like Colorado, Illinois, Maine, Maryland, New Hampshire, Oregon, and Rhode Island, plus Virginia and Washington State, that prohibit non-competes in a lot of different ways. You have to be making so much money, or you would have had to sell a business or something of that nature. So there's this movement to say, hey, this is not good. All of this comes around the issue of there being a lot of job openings. And so when you put all of this together, usually in larger cities and probably more sophisticated organizations, Phoenix, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Miami, Dallas, Houston, and you can name the bigger ones, there's a fear of our best people, our best gift officers going to another nonprofit and taking the relationships with them. All of this brings us to, what does all of this mean? So let's start generically with the positives and negatives of a non-compete. And you may come at this as a individual going, non-competes are totally unfair. You may come at this as a consultant who owns a consulting company. It kind of sounds like me. And you look at it and say, well, no, there's positives of this. I just want you to see both sides of the argument, and then we'll get into the tactical about what you really should be thinking about if this happens to come to you, or as the issue continues to grow. So we'll concentrate, by the way, mostly on nonprofits. I'll throw in some consulting examples, because I know I have some consultants that listen. A little bit different perspective there. Similar, but a little different, variants. So the first thing is, what are the positives of non-competes? So the first thing is that it protects business, what they call trade secrets and confidential information. When you are a business owner and you set up your processes to do your job, and I'll use me as an example, how I do grateful patient work, how I do campaign work, how I do feasibility or counsel, how I do coaching. You want those things, if you invest your time, effort, and energy, to remain yours, confidential, meaning you can use them if you believe they're any good. And if they are good and you can attract clients with them, you're like, this works and I don't want others to be doing this. If you have employees that can just take those things and leave and reapply them into their own, let's say, new business, then that becomes a really big issue, because basically, as my mom would say, it's kind of stealing. The other part is the relationships, which actually applies into the gift officers, is if you have, let's take a nonprofit, and you have a really good gift officer that has great connections to huge philanthropists, they can pick up the phone or text and there's immediate response. You as an organization have invested in that person to develop those relationships, to talk about your mission. And if someone else can come in and just take them, and they can take those relationships, that becomes a problem for that organization. Number two is that non-competes, in some ways, unofficially force employers to invest in their employees because you don't want them to leave. And so training, how do I make them better? Education, how can they grow? Even into things like promotions, bonuses. How do we reward the people that are delivering us the best? Because what we don't want is our best employees to fight a non-compete. The last thing is it prevents what may be thought of as unfair competition. Rating of information, this was kind of alluded to in number one, where you could have someone who goes in purposely, and by the way, in the for-profit world, this is it's not common, but it's not unheard of, where people go in, try to get a bunch of information, and then they use that information once they've learned it for a year or two to leverage a different opportunity. It's unfair competition, meaning trade secret stealing. We have a big issue, and it's talked about from an international perspective with other countries stealing commercialized or industrialized secrets and taking them back to other countries and then replicating what we do here. Corporate spying. Those are the big three that are positives. There are also three that are negatives. So when we think about non-competes, the first thing is it restricts your employees or an employee's mobility and career growth. If all of a sudden you can't take a promotion because of a non-compete, that stymies growth. Number two is that it reduces innovation and competition. The innovation piece is, could you take something you've learned someplace here, leave and reintroduce it at a higher level because you see a different way of doing it? The other thing is competition. So from a free enterprise perspective, if you have multiple people competing for a particular job, or you have multiple people competing for philanthropic relationships, there's a value in that when we talk about supply and demand. The more supply there is, that means that the price probably goes down because there's more options. Non-competes stymie that because innovation and competition, meaning people going out and doing things on their own and creating a new way of doing it, maybe doing it cheaper, is hindered by a non-compete. And the third is that a non-compete, especially when it's authoritative, meaning you have to sign this or you can't have the job, we'll get to that in a moment, creates immense legal and financial burdens on an employee. Because if you've signed a non-compete in some way, shape, or form, maybe haven't done the due diligence, which is part of the job when you took it, all of a sudden you're like, as you're trying to go, well, how do I get out of this? And now you're like, do I need to talk to a lawyer? I got to pay them. I'm taking a chance if I leave. Somebody could sue me. That's a financial burden. There are positive and negatives to this, but there are also alternatives. And this is where we get into the combination of the tactical and thoughts to have. When we talk about consultants, this is where we get into a little bit wider perspective. Because consulting, you may not move, but you might have different areas geographically that you might serve. So the first thing that's a possibility is limiting from a reasonableness perspective. That's kind of the legal thought process. How do I create something that's reasonable? I want to protect what's mine, but I don't want to over restrict the employee or employees to be able to do what they need to do. So how do you create that in terms of scope? Meaning you restrict it in terms of what it is they do. And the Supreme Court's actually weighed in here. I'll use a dental example because that was what the case was about, where a dentist who was a day-to-day dentist signed or sold his company, signed a non-compete, and then he went and became an oral surgeon. And the commentary from the people buying the company was, or buying his practice, you signed a non-compete, you can't do that. And the Supreme Court said, no, that's not what you said. You said he couldn't be a dentist. He's not, he's an oral surgeon. And so scope matters, meaning if you're a major gift officer, but you're going to go do annual giving work, probably that's different. The second is duration. How long does somebody have to sit out? If you have something or somebody wants you to sign something says you have to sit out of working in this field for 3 years, I'm going to tell you that the courts are going to most likely say that's not reasonable. We'll get into a couple of issues just to keep in the back of your mind that might preclude that conversation or argument in a moment. The third is by geographic area. It's really hard to say, well, you can't go be a fundraiser anywhere in the country. It's not reasonable in terms of geographic area. Could you say you can't be a fundraiser in Chicago? That gets a little tougher because Chicago's a big area. If you worked up, let's say in Evanston, but you moved down to Joliet to take a job, those are really two different markets. Versus, I'll take my Omaha, much smaller, much fewer people. So part of this is to make sure that we're protecting the employee's interests, but not creating an undue burden or restriction. So you can moderate. Number two is public policy. There are certain areas where we say, yeah, we're not going to apply confidentiality or a non-disclosure, non-competition, non-compete agreements. So it's like firefighters and police officers. Those are public policy decisions that we need police officers. So we're going to do whatever we can to ensure that they have the flexibility to move where they need to move. So just be aware that sometimes, and this could apply to nonprofits, depending on the type of nonprofit professional you are, is what you're doing a public benefit? Meaning probably there should be a restriction on enforcing a non-compete. The third is to ensure that there is immense clarity and disclosure as it comes to signing one. Unfortunately, and this is part of the statistical challenge, the last number I saw is 11 to 12% of all employees in the United States are under a certain type of or a portion of a non-compete, and in positions that don't need it. If you are an unbelievably dedicated administrative assistant providing immense value to your organization, it's really hard to argue that you shouldn't be able to go to another job and do the same thing. We've got too many people under these agreements, which is what the problem is. And so part of this is making sure that it's not forced down employees' throats when every employee has to sign one in the organization. Not every employee should. Not every employee has the same value as it pertains to being able to take trade secrets or customers or confidential information. There's different levels of that kind of intrinsic value. Doesn't mean everybody doesn't have a role and everyone's not important, but not everybody is going to have the same access. So what we're seeing is more conversation around, hey, are the right people doing this? And are you sitting down as an employer saying, let me explain to you what this does, and not just forcing people to sign it? The last thing I want to talk about is what it is you should be aware of. The first thing, as we mentioned a second ago, that this is the tactical piece, is there are different roles. If the organization is forcing everybody to sign a non-compete, there's probably going to be a problem. But if you're an executive and you are at a nonprofit or for-profit, and you are the hub of the wheel, things work through you, you know everything, it's possible the organization could try to restrict your ability to move. Number two, are there unenforceable terms? And we talked about this a few minutes ago. Duration, you can't do anything for 5 years, or you can't do anything forever. I mean, that's just not reasonable. Or you can't do it anywhere in the country. Or the activity, you can't do anything in philanthropy. There are lots of different roles in philanthropy. Those are not probably unenforceable. They're just not enforceable from a legal perspective. Number three is where you tricked or forced into signing. Number four, which I find interesting, which actually has happened, I have some personal experience, where the employer says, make sure you get this signed, but the employee never signs it. They go into their work, and then all of a sudden they leave, and they go, well, you signed in a non-compete, and it turns out they never signed it. If you never signed it, it's not enforceable. I don't care what the company policy is. The last thing I would say is, what did they offer you? And this is the follow the money conversation in two variations. If you signed a signing bonus, this is a contractual obligation. They gave you $50,000, and if you stay 3 years, you don't have to pay it back. Plus, there's the non-compete. As soon as you get something, that changes the equation when it comes to non-competes, as well as in almost any contract, because you accepted something of value to give that up. They bought that. Now, if it's all kinds of other things that don't exist, or it's too big, or the unenforceable pieces of duration, geography, and activity, that's still going to be a part of the conversation. But the way organizations are beginning to push into this is they're saying, we gave you a signing bonus and then we wiped it away after a couple of years. You're still on the hook. That's an issue. The second thing is the outcome. And I had a good friend, and this is in banking, who left one bank to go to another in the community and got sued. And the question became, well, did he take any of his customers? Did he tell them I was leaving and try to steal them? No, he just left. Well, did the bank who he was at once lose any money from this? No. The money makes a difference. If you've given your rights away because you got something, or you're taking clients away, you're taking donors away, you're taking trade secrets away that makes someone else money or generates money and loses the organization you left money, that becomes an issue. That's a heavy burden for a court to figure out whether or not there is an executable agreement. All of this is to say, I think we're going to see more of this, particularly in larger communities, and the really valuable, really talented gift officers, money producers, who organizations may start to say, we got to lock you down. Here's my recommendation. Make sure you're happy before you sign anything. Make sure you're getting what you want before you sign anything. And if you don't want to do what they're asking, don't sign it. There may be a consequence for that. But the minute you sign, the onus becomes on you. I would also argue the smaller the community, the geographic area that you have, the less likely they are to be enforceable. You can't restrict someone's ability to go make a living in totality. So the bigger communities may have more flexibility with this. Smaller communities might not. And if you're a national nonprofit with employees all over the place, it's going to be harder to enforce a non-compete unless it's an incredibly high position, unless it's one that is CEO, CFO with immense knowledge and immense connections, and they go to an organization almost the exact same. This is all about size and scope. I found it interesting that in literally under 45 days, I've had 2 or 3 conversations about this, which tells me there are more people thinking about it. We're going to have to think about it as well, because if it moves the way I think it's going to, there'll be more people who are signing their rights away and then upset and angry when they can't move because they got a bad boss. They don't believe in the organization anymore. There are challenges, or heaven forbid, the great American dream, they get a better opportunity and all of a sudden they don't feel like they can go. Keep in mind all of these thoughts as you, as a valuable, important member of a nonprofit, look to your future. Think about them and know that what you're doing, what your decisions are today, can affect you tomorrow. Don't forget, check out the blogs. 2-week, 90-second reads. Interesting things that I see, feel, know. I think I know at least. On the website at howlphilanthropy.com, you get an RSS feed right to you. And if you'd like to reach out to me, it's podcast at howlphilanthropy.com. We are moving into the second half of 2024 here in a little bit. I think there's some interesting things that are going to come. We have an election of uncertainty. We've got a diminishment of donors that I think we're going to have the Giving USA and Giving Collaborative come out and talk more about. I think we're going to have issues involving total dollars, and we may see a reduction in philanthropy as a whole. What you do is critically important. The relationships you build in the community are important. The relationships you have internally are unbelievably important. Don't forget what I always say. The old Gaelic saying, some people make things happen, some people watch things happen. Then there are those who wondered what happened. You're someone who's making something happen. You're finding other people who want to do the same. Particularly if you're a board member or a fundraiser, you're finding those philanthropists who are trying to figure out how to make their community a better place. You represent a way that they can do that. Your people are making things happen. That is incredibly worthwhile. And you're doing it for a population, both of people and organizations who are wondering what happened. Pretty cool way to spend a professional career. Realize the value that you bring every day. I'll look forward to seeing you next time, right back here on the next edition of Around with Randall. Don't forget, make it a great day.